Hey, good morning or good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. I'm Holly Campo, and I'll be the chair for this panel titled Trust, Hope, and Risk, What Matters? Now we have an exciting lineup here, so allow me to welcome Alison Liebling from Cambridge, Yvonne Jukes from University of Bath, and Thomas Uglevik from University of Oslo. We will go in order of the program, and speakers will have 20 minutes each for their presentations. And a reminder to our audience to keep those questions coming in the YouTube chat. These will be forwarded to us and to our speakers. So let's get started. We're going to go right into this. Alison, over to you.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone, and congratulations to Alberta on your new Centre for Criminological Research. Many thanks for organising this conference. It's really good to be part of it, even in a distant form. And thanks also for putting me on a well-coordinated panel with two of my friends. We haven't collaborated, but I'm confident that we'll have much to say to each other as well as to all of you. So my paper is a work in progress. It's the basis of two writing projects, one a chapter in a book I'm currently writing, and the second, a paper I'm working on with my colleague, Ryan Williams. And one of the questions I'm wrestling with is this. What are the relationships between trust and distrust and respect and disrespect? And what are their relationships? Welcome. It is a work in progress. It's the basis of two writing projects, a chapter and a paper with my colleague. So I just got to the question I'm wrestling with, and it's this. What are the relationships between trust and distrust and respect and disrespect, and what are their relationships in turn with violence? Distrust plus disrespect seems to be especially toxic, but then how do we handle real risk? And I'm drawing on three empirical projects carried out over 20 years to explore these questions, a period during which we've almost given up on trust. So I'm trying to revive it, but intelligently. So let me start with a quotation from a prisoner in the most recent of these projects. He said, "You're not afraid of me, that's respect." He was a long-term prisoner in a high security prison on an internal procedure of no one-to-one contact. His skin tone was very dark, Talisa, and he had a lot of muscle. The governor used him as an example of someone you wouldn't want to be on your own in a room with. I just had been, and at the end of our project, he wrote and performed us an amazing rap about trust. Our constant questioning about him eventually unplugged him and he moved on. He ended up in this extreme high-risk category because staff distrusted and they also disliked him. But some female staff had gone to him for advice about building muscles in their arms. He'd once been a personal trainer, added another kind of charge we don't talk about into the mix. The one I want to talk about in this paper is a dimension we're calling political charge. I should declare then that I dislike distrust morally. On the other hand, as Preston Roeder has argued recently, blind faith in humanity is naive. Another philosophy scholar, Jason de Cruz, argues that trust loses its power to signal respect when it's indiscriminate. So how do trust and distrust work in prison, and what's the impact of a changed distribution of both? What do we do with our own felt distrust? How should we treat it morally? How should institutions respond to betrayal? As de Cruz argues, one psychologically salient case can get leveraged by those seeking to stoke distrust. On the other hand, there are in our world vivid risks. So how do we know where to place trust? Which side of the pessimism versus faith in humanity continuum is it better to err in a high-risk environment like a maximum security prison? The problem exists all around us. Barbara Mischel argues that the problems of trust are directly connected with the most urgent and important questions of the modern world. They're painfully real. So the problem is that trust is risky. Trust is the only dimension in my moral performance framework, based on a set of dimensions that matter most to prisoners, that seems to have an upper limit. So unlike, for example, respect, humanity, or mostly the quality of staff-prisoner relationships, too much trust leads to security risks, escape and violence in examples I can describe. Largely for this reason, when we adapted the Moral Performance Survey for use by the Prison Service in 2002, we left trust out without realizing at the time that this omission was a major conceptual mistake. It mattered, after all, and this qualified it to remain in the framework, even if the ways in which it matters are highly complex. It should have stayed in for another reason too. There are high moral stakes of misplaced distrust or signals of interpersonal distrust, as we were to find out later. So trust has upper and lower limits, and it can be found in the wrong places. Staff sometimes trust prisoners more than they trust senior managers, as we found in 2 prisons of 5, for example, and this has serious sociological consequences. So my overall argument in this paper is as follows. First, that counterintuitively trust exists or flows in prison. Second, it has both upper and lower limits and can be in the wrong places. Third, there are major risks of violence at both ends of this continuum. 4, the distance between too much and too little is unusually small. The right place is like a pinhead. 5, unlike all other prison quality dimensions, trust flows or is placed in selective and unusually guarded ways. More explicit decisions are made about trust and where it belongs in prison than about some other values. 6, trust is built slowly, and this requires familiarity and engagement. 7, it's decayed in prisons and late modern societies, so felt distrust is increasing. 8, unmerited distrust or encountering others with skepticism brings with it many moral and material hazards. When we compare prisons, the lowest levels of trust are found to be associated with higher levels of political charge or anger and alienation among prisoners, and the presence of steeply hierarchical and power-infused religious identities. Prisons with some trust generate less anger and alienation and produce a different constellation of less power-infused faith identities. Prisoners express more religious doubt, they invite each other to unfamiliar ceremonies, and they approach others with curiosity instead of fear or rivalry. And this is also true of staff. 9, the concepts of intelligent trust, growing trustworthiness, and ongoing sensitivity to evidence help us to navigate these troubled waters more carefully than the narrow concept of risk. And finally, working at the limits of our trust threshold is extremely challenging. I won't get through all this, obviously, in my remarks today, but I want to see how far I can develop my thinking in 13 more minutes, and I'll be grateful for questions and thoughts from co-presenters as well as from all of you out there in space. So the first point I want to illustrate is, surprising as it sounds to some, trust exists or flows in prison, but we tend not to notice it until it disappears. And let me give you a nice example from one of my earliest studies. I'm talking 1986. I was observing life on a wing in a women's prison, notebook in hand. A bird flew onto the wing through a small slatted window. A female officer, who suffered from a fear of birds, leapt into the nearest cell, shutting the door behind her and inadvertently locking herself in. She called to a prisoner through the hatch. They talked. She passed her keys under the door and the prisoner let her out. Once out, she thanked the prisoner, reattached her keys to her chain, and life on the wing resumed as normal. This was arguably, despite being against the rules, a good trust decision. That is, she knew who she could trust, even if her action was a bit desperate. She turned to me and said, "Don't write that in your notebook." She clearly trusted the prisoner more than she trusted me on 2 counts. She didn't call me over, and she was nervous about my note writing. My guess is that this scene couldn't happen today, so vivid has the trust problem become, alongside the armory of distrust, cameras, security information reporting, audits, and so on. A more sustained account of trust and its flow in prison can be found in my first study of Whitemoor High Security Prison in 1998-9, although we were not aware at the time, when we wrote the report, or the prison officer book which draws on it, how present it was or how much work it was doing. That study of staff-prisoner relationships can now be read in retrospect as a study of trust. Staff and prisoners talked about it all the time, how it's built, why it matters, and how relationships transmitted or contained both degrees of power and authority and degrees of trust and respect. And this was despite the fact that prison staff had been traumatized by much disorder and eventually a series of escapes during the prison's early years, and had been accused of appeasement. Two enlightened governors had guided them through these betrayals and encouraged the building of a form of guarded trust that made the prison feel reasonably legitimate for a time. Helen Arnold and I first described the distribution of trust empirically in 5 establishments in prisons and their moral performance. We found it varied significantly from 2.64 in a high security prison to 3.16 in a private prison, where 3 is a neutral score and above it is positive. The score of 3.16 in the private prison was too high. 37% of prisoners agreed with the item, "I feel like I'm trusted quite a lot in this prison." 2 escapes were linked to staff having a somewhat naive relationship with or view of prisoners. There are other examples of too much trust in prison which have led to catastrophic outcomes. But we're also aware of prisons where levels have been higher, so conditions can be created in which more of it is possible. In our moral performance framework, trust was most highly correlated with humanity, respect, fairness, support, and relationships. In the literature, it's also linked to hope. It's inherently optimistic, and it's also been linked to civility and dignity. We thought our first attempt to operationalise and measure trust was not very good in that study, and we carelessly abandoned it. Mishtal suggests it's one of the most difficult concepts to handle in empirical research. Now, as I argued a moment ago, we didn't notice how much work trust was doing, the impact of its presence, until we restudied Whitemoor Prison 10 years after the first study in 2009-10 and found it newly absent. In fact, we described the prison as paralysed by distrust. This was in a very much changed climate. Not only was trust absent, but having read De Cruz now, I see, distrust had become active in the prison. Prisoners were taken to the segregation unit, placed on special measures, knocked back at recategorization reviews, or transferred out of the prison because their demeanour or behaviour felt risky, particularly, but not exclusively, if they were or became Muslim. We returned to Whitemoor Prison 4 years after the UK's worst terrorist incident since 1988 and its first Islamic suicide attack in London in 2005. A second incident was narrowly averted 2 weeks later. Several high-profile prisoners convicted of offences against the Terrorism Act were located at Whitemoor. We walked into a full staff counter-terrorism training event on day 1 of the project. The suicide video of the 7/7 bomber was shown. New allegiances between the police, prisons, and MI5 were being forged, with very explicit messages to staff. You're the front line, the threat is to us and our families, these are the prisoners of the future, and so on. Staffing levels, meanwhile, as Kate has just said, were newly lean under a workforce modernisation programme. Just as the task of managing a highly complex and challenging population increased, staffing resources and the valuable experience that went with exiting longer-serving officers were significantly reduced. Staff felt abandoned and isolated following a series of serious assaults. William Schultz talked about some of these kinds of feelings yesterday. There were also feelings of hostility. Staff were not as present on the wings as they had been in the previous study. So the most significant finding in this research was that trust had declined, and this seemed to be linked to high levels of violence in the prison. The study was mainly ethnographic, but we'd used our growing moral performance survey. 63% of prisoners did not feel trusted, nor was there much trust in officers among prisoners. 55% of prisoners agreed they have to be wary of everyone around them, and a very large majority of prisoners agreed that they felt stuck in the system, that decisions in this prison are dominated by concerns about security, and that all they care about in this prison is my risk factors rather than the person that I really am. Prisoners complained about their treatment by staff, noting in particular poor attitudes, disrespect, difficulty in getting help, and racism and discrimination. It's worth explaining at this point that 42% of the prisoners were Muslim, half of whom had converted in prison, some apparently under pressure and inducement. He gets money sent in from sources since he became a Muslim, said other prisoners. 65% of the prisoners were Black, Asian, or mixed race, compared to 25% in the first study. The other main finding from this research was that prisoners were more oppositional and frustrated than they'd been in the first study. We described this as a new feeling of anger and alienation in the prison. Changing social conditions and sentencing practices linked to changing population demographics meant that most prisoners were viscerally aware of feeling excluded, disadvantaged, and over-policed. These illegitimate features of life outside, distributive injustice, explain their routes into prison, as well as their inexplicably long and indeterminate sentences. Aspects of street culture and capital, evident in language, clothing, demeanour, attitudes, and musical expression, were visibly present in the long corridors of the prison as alpha male, gym-sculpted, exposed bodies jostled for space or carried themselves with a defensive posture. Prisoners were resistant and in some ways organised, albeit in new groups. Many exerted power where they could find it. There were strong feelings of bitterness, lack of respect and unfairness were present in the prison, but also feelings of pride, solidarity, and identity exertion. Some versions of this energy were dignified and empowering. In a well-attended music workshop where songwriting was encouraged, the lyrics often expressed feelings of fear, uncertainty, longing, love, and pain, as well as anger. In some prisoners' interview accounts, however, there was a different kind of energy, more hopeless and resigned, and linked to an expressed and growing hatred of the state. Prisoners' collective accounts of their experience in dialogue groups or more informal discussions were more politicised than they had been in the previous study. This was a bleak study to carry out. After a bit of soul searching, we worked out that we needed to bring trust back into view with a better designed study, so more than one prison for comparative purposes, some new prison quality dimensions, and a new team with expertise in religious studies and rap. So in a follow-up study, locating and building trust in 3 other high security prisons, this is what we did. Apart from the usual observation, use of dialogue groups and long interviews, we developed 3 new dimensions to add to our moral performance survey for this study. Trust, confidence in the people around me or a flow of faith in others. Intelligent trust, the appropriate placing of trust or recognition of trustworthiness. And political charge, anger and indignation or reactivity. The political charge dimension includes items like, my time in this prison has made me angry. I feel more like fighting back than giving in this prison. And the prison authorities are guiltier than I am for wrongdoing. Our hunch was that this dimension might work, like distress works as an intermediate variable for suicide risk in our other studies. Mark Ham had suggested that failed, violent, and politically charged prisons were demonstrably more likely to produce radicalisation. Our argument is that such prisons produce a whole range of bad outcomes, including, but not limited to, the not always helpful term, radicalisation. We found that levels of trust were low, but differed significantly, and that levels of political charge were high and also differed significantly, in line with trust and intelligent trust. What took us by surprise, though, was that different trust-distrust climates produced very different faith behaviours. So low trust and high political charge were linked to the presence of steeply hierarchical and power-infused religious identities instead of open-minded or exploratory faith-based religious identities. In a regression model, we found that variations in levels of political charge were explained by differences in levels of humanity, bureaucratic legitimacy, decency, staff-prisoner relationships, and intelligent trust. In our fieldwork, we could see that wings where talk and dialogue were not eclipsed by fear, prisoners often moved away from both violent ideologies and violent behaviour. The most serious incidents we encountered during this project, including a hostage taking of a member of staff and attempted beheading, took place on the wings with the lowest scores on all of these dimensions. Prisoners were so moved by our project on trust, or the opportunity to talk about it, that in our 2 main fieldwork sites, they introduced trust committees so they could keep the dialogue flowing when we left. There's much more to say and lots of figures underpinning this account, but for now, let me just conclude. The dimension trust operates in several distinctive ways, or has a distinctive chemistry. It's like a powerful, highly reactive primary compound. Both trust and distrust come with action tendencies. Distrust functions as a biasing device, tampering evidence so as to make us insensible to signals that others are trustworthy. Distrust subjects people to moral condemnation or other sanctions that they do not deserve, thereby wronging them and causing distress, anger, frustration, and alienation. It has a propensity to bias interpretation, to confirm and perpetuate itself, and to insult. Trust and distrust can both be wrongly placed with catastrophic consequences, and they tend to reproduce themselves. Unmerited distrust is a form of cruelty. The trust problem, however, might mean taking risks incrementally and being humble about our assumptions. There is certainly an argument for self-scrutiny, as de Cruz says, for skepticism about the warrant of one's own felt attitudes of both trust and distrust. Jonathan Sachs argues that the antidote to violence is conversation. We have considerable evidence in this last project that this is the case. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alison. A very rich analysis of trust and other important interactional dynamics. Okay, so next we have Yvonne Jukes. Over to you.
Okay, can you see that? Cool. All right, so I feel somewhat reassured by what Shad said earlier about owning up to our own lived experience, but my paper today is still a little bit unusual. The paper's drawn from a book that I'm writing, and as I started writing it in March, a book about prison architecture morphed into something quite different to what I'd originally intended. I immersed myself in the writing of it, in the strangeness and stillness of lockdown, and it's become a very personal account that draws on the experiences that I've had as an academic, researching prison design, conducting now 4 ESRC-supported studies, and my engagements as a consultant on new prison designs in the UK, Ireland, Australia, and New Zealand. But it's now also inflected with autobiographical narratives about the end of a significant relationship and my relationship to my home, which was built in the same year as Leicester Prison, which you can see here, 1825. And it's been a long renovation project. I've used Freud's concept of the uncanny to capture the peculiar kind of fear positioned between real terror and faint anxiety that one's environment can instill, whether carceral or domestic. I've written about the history of my house and contemporaneous prisons, the trauma that can be held within walls, and the uncanny compulsion to repeat past behaviours, including violence and self-destruction. I'll emphasise at the outset that I am not saying that isolating at home is like being in prison. My aspiration is to hold 2 narratives in parallel in order to understand the importance to all of us of the environments in which we spend most of our time. And in the book, I examine how a prison, like a home or a long-term relationship, can start as a carrier of hope and become a place of hopelessness. I discuss spectres and shadows, the traces of past lives, which in my home were apparent in various forms of destruction wreaked on it over the 200 years, but in prisons are evident in, for example, the graffiti, the cigarette stains, and the traces of bodily fluids that are imprinted on every surface of many cells. This is Limerick Prison, Limerick Women's Prison, which I'll return to in a few moments. Cultural theorists Horkheimer and Adorno noted that we find ourselves in harmony with the ghosts that share our living space because we, like them, are the victims of the same condition and the same disappointed hope. I've linked hope to light, reflecting in my book on the enveloping darkness that can descend when hope feels fickle, elusive, or unachievable. But like architect Louis Kahn, I believe that the occupants of any building should be able to claim a slice of the sun. It's one of the reasons why, when I learned that the new prisons in England and Wales that are being built with no bars on the windows, partly as a result of the presentations that my colleague Dominique Moran and I gave to the Ministry of Justice and their architects on the first ESRC project, it felt as significant as any other achievement in my research career. The connection between light and hope is well established in psychology, though it's more usually inverted, with studies finding that dim environments make people feel more hopeless. And while I don't believe that barless windows and greater claims to sunlight can ever make up for the dull, deadening routine of many prison regimes, I do believe that the dual meanings of enlightenment, making luminous and displaying a kind of higher knowledge and insight, are advanced by positive aesthetics and thoughtfully designed architecture. In that sense, I think the real benefit of doing away with bars on windows is the symbolic message it sends, that society itself has moved from an atavistic view of prisoners to one of relative enlightenment. But hope is a slippery concept to pin down. One prisoner at England and Wales' most recently built prison said, "Berwyn can break your heart just like that. Aim small, miss small." Which sums up perfectly to me the need to dampen hope to realistic levels of expectation. However, a common response from prisoners to questions about hope is to pose the question back to the interviewer. What is hope? What do you mean by hope? Illustrating that some people in prison simply don't recognise hope as a realistic or achievable path from the darkness of embittered despair. Philosophy professor Drew Lader writes about a discussion of hope that took place in a class he taught in an American prison. Some of his students said that hope in prison is an imperiled, almost irrational feeling, though vital to try and acquire if one is to imagine a future not already in ruins. Their discussion echoes Ernst Bloch's belief that hope must be worked at. Unlike optimism, which is based on opinion that things tend to turn out well, hope is a project that requires strenuous commitment. It asks for more than life promises, and it's forever poised for disappointment. We might say then that optimism is light and hope is heavy. When it comes to prison design, my research findings are echoed in Liebling et al.'s article about HMP Warren Hill, Are Hope and Possibility Achievable in Prison? The authors say the design of the prison contributes to a sense of personal growth. They note that the site is set out in such a way that prisoners and staff encounter each other several times a day, without any sense that it's cramped or oppressive. The absence of internal fences and gates contributes to this sense of openness. The physical environment is well kept. An effort clearly goes into its upkeep, decoration, and the imaginative use of space. One of the first signs seen when walking through the gate says hope. None of this seems unduly controversial to me. A clean environment with open spaces allowing for a relatively generous freedom of movement and multiple opportunities for human interaction seem like the minimum we should expect of an institution in which many prisoners and staff will spend many years of their lives. Unsurprisingly, few prisoners relate their surroundings to feelings of hope unless specifically asked, but a pervasive feeling of hopelessness often accompanies their descriptions of their environments. So when asked, for example, what colour is prison, the near unanimous response is grey, which is used to signify mental atrophy and is frequently accompanied by words like dull, dreary, and depressing. Even the architectural utopia of Halden Prison, set in a forest in southern Norway, which dazzles outsiders and is taken as a symbol of everything that is humane, progressive, and enlightened about Nordic penal policy, is described in distinctly dystopian terms by the men who live there. With only 3 exceptions, the answer to the question, what colour is prison, from the men at Halden was grey. And the exceptions were bleak, dark, and prison is normally grey, but this one is green, I think. Dark colours, concrete surfaces, cage-like interiors, bare walls, hard floors, bars on windows, and uncomfortable furniture are some of the common carceral design features that diminish individual self-esteem and feelings of hope. The architectural theorist Charles Jenks believed that a cheerless, ugly, or sensorily depriving environment stunts the growth of the brain, denying the self the richness of stuff it requires to write its own personality. The idea that institutional environments lack richness and meaning because of their missing parts in turn speaks to the question of what it means to be human and what we need in order to be creative, hopeful, and fulfilled. It makes me pause to reflect how the endless, stultifying unfinishedness of my house, the feeling of living in a dark, undone space for many years, caused me to feel something of myself slipping away. And I've come to believe that beauty, light, humanity, creativity, and hope are interlinked. Studies from psychology lend credence to the idea that engaging people with beauty, whether in art or nature, leads to higher levels of hopefulness, which in turn correlates with social development, happiness, and the warding off of despair. For ex-life without parole prisoner Kenneth Hartman, the idea of a beautiful prison requires a tremendous leap of imagination. But he underlines Pascal's belief in the importance of keeping a little contour of beauty in one's heart. Hartman says that having borne the weight of decades of abuse and hatred, of the vilest of characterizations and the meanest of mean spirits, he has remarkably seen beauty in prison, stumbled across it and been the beneficiary of its soothing balm. Perhaps like the green shoots of spring's conquest of winter, he says, the key to enduring the bleakness is a selective focus and a hopeful disposition. In a similar vein, philosophy Professor Margaret Urban Walker says the human capacity for hope can be astonishing, like weeds that can grow up through the smallest cracks in slabs of concrete. She adds, hope too is a kind of growth towards the light. But what if there is no light to grow towards? I write in the book about several prisons that started off hopeful, including by design, but lost hope. And I also discuss facilities that were purposefully designed to crush hope. And sometimes hopelessness is a result of broader social forces. At the Docus Centre in Dublin, Docus is Gaelic for hope, by the way, I write about how an inspiring governor became hamstrung by draconian financial policies and sentencing practices. There were simply not enough places in the prison estate for the number of women being given custodial sentences. In another example, a former prison inspector told me about an inspection of the high security detainee unit at HMP Long Lartin, with a small number of men who are held to be a threat to national security. She said the impact of the closed, restrictive environment and regime on mental health was immense, commenting, all of them had been detained for a long time, up to 7 years, without charge, let alone conviction, and were not even told why they were being detained, save for a vague letter from the Home Office. How can one possibly keep hope in those circumstances? Recounting a very different experience when working as a psychologist at Full Sutton, another high security English prison, in the mid-90s, the same professional said that a well-known fashion brand worked with a group of prisoners designing and making outfits, culminating in a fashion show to other prisoners and staff 6 months later. She said, one man on the programme told me it was the best time of his entire life. He said it gave him a reason to get up in the morning. Of course, she said, it wouldn't be allowed now. Interestingly, given that she spent much of her career working as a prison psychologist, she concluded, it taught me that cultivating hope is far more powerful than raking up the past, as sadly many offending behaviour programmes seem to do. She gave her view of the role of the environment. The prison environment can shape its inhabitants and their identities in so many ways. Does the space continually say to them, you are a prisoner and a criminal, not to be trusted or respected? Or does the space say, you're a father in a well-designed visiting area, or you're a cook in a homely residential unit kitchen, or you're a craftsman in a workshop where they're gaining qualifications? I suppose one environment allows hope to flourish and another kills it off. Shad Maruna famously argues that resettlement research should be desistance focused, meaning that the most effective policy for people leaving prison not only limits the worst aspects of imprisonment, separation from family, detachment from work, isolation in a negative or hostile setting, and so on, but seeks actively to encourage attachments in situations that are strongly linked to success on release. And I think architecture and design could have much more of an enabling role, one that delabels the criminal and relabels them with a positive identity as responsible father, skilled motor mechanic, university student, master gardener, or whatever. So what if prisons were not like Plato's cave, with inmates cut off from reality, consigned to watching shadows on the wall? What if prisons were places of light and places for enlightenment? Throughout my career, I've championed Maggie's cancer care centres and encouraged prison architects to reflect on the values and aesthetics they incorporate, which are underpinned by the Enlightenment tradition that design of the environment can do more for health and well-being than the medical profession can. Established by the architect Maggie Keswick, who died of cancer in 1993, many Maggie centres, of which there are now 24, are designed by architects such as Frank Gehry, Norman Foster, Richard Rogers, and Zaha Hadid. The brief for Maggie's requires architects to design buildings that hold qualities of safety and welcome intention, alongside atmospheric effects that are surprising and thought-provoking. The centres are all unique, you can see one of them here, but they're linked by design that is defined by inarguably positive qualities: light, beauty, intimacy, connectedness to nature, and homely in space and feeling, all combining to form what their co-founder Charles Jenks called an architecture of hope. I'm certain that a prison that is thoughtfully designed for the population it will hold, not future-proofed, can make a positive difference to the life of those who live and work in it. I'm convinced that good design need cost no more than bad design, and that persuading prison commissioners and architects to design with hope and human flourishing in mind, rather than security, control and punishment, is of benefit to prisoners, staff and to society. I'm even inclined to think that prison buildings that permit sunlight to enter and allow patterns and shadows to play across the surfaces might stimulate creativity or calm, as they do for me and for the users of Maggie centres. But I'm also the first to admit that the capacity of architecture to carry and nurture hope is limited. An enlightened architect can have little long-term influence if prison managers and staff remain in the dark about where to find the potential in people, or fail to look for the humanity in prisons, or who are simply hampered in their efforts by wider forces. And even the most empathetically and imaginatively designed prisons may be experienced as places of hopelessness for those who have multiple reasons to despair. Terry Eagleton notes that sometimes individuals' hopes will come to nothing simply because the force of the past proves stronger than the pull of the future. Tellingly, I think, many prisoners choose to block the light from their cell windows at all times. Reasons offered are sometimes pragmatic, I keep it dark so I can see the TV, but are often existential. One female prisoner said, "I'm not really much for light. I keep curtains down and my lamp on. If I go outside to exercise, that's the only light I'm getting." Another said she looked forward to the darkness. You're looking for that night because you know the next day is another day. You tick another day off the calendar. Of course, many women in prison in the UK and Ireland report an acutely more painful experience than men, with many suffering complex emotional biographies and histories of community-based trauma and abuse, including often having been victims of much more serious offences than those for which they're convicted. For some, prison is a place of respite and refuge. But it may be that hope for many prisoners is encumbered by a weighty past and an uncertain and precarious future in ways that keep individuals unreconciled to the present. In environments that carry hopelessness in their very form and fabric, prisoners and prison staff may be compulsively inclined to repeat learned familiar behaviours that limit hope and hinder enlightenment. Tragically, those who commission and design prisons, and the politicians and public who provide them with a mandate to do so, seem similarly destined to remain locked in uncanny cycles of repetition. Consequently, not only do we retain our deep cultural attachment to the prison, but in many jurisdictions, we seem stuck with a 19th century architectural template. However, I want to finish with an example of a prison that I've been involved with almost from its conception, the new women's prison in Limerick in Ireland. The current old Limerick prison, which I showed earlier, originates from 1821. Cellular accommodation there is poor, with all prisoners held in catacomb-like cells with tiny, heavily barred windows and poor ventilation. Access to natural daylight is scarce, and the exercise yards are small concrete spaces with high walls and razor wire. But I convinced IPS, the Irish Prison Service, to hold a design competition for the award of the contract for the new prison. I helped write the design brief, which was partly underpinned by the brief for Maggie Centres. I was involved in a two-stage evaluation process, with the contract eventually being awarded to PJ Hegarty for a design that was a radical departure for IPS and was highly unusually the second most expensive submission shortlisted, demonstrating that it really was design, not cost, that was prioritised. Limerick is a light, bright, safe environment, homely and trauma-informed, and I think it comes pretty close to an architecture of hope.
Yvonne, for that fascinating account of the connection between environment, architecture, hope, and this very important work at Limerick. Thank you so much. Okay, to our final speaker, over to Thomas Uglevik.
Okay, thank you, Holly, and thank you also to Sandra and Kevin for including me in your plans for this great conference. If I can just share my screen here. Okay. Okay, trust. Trust is a fundamental part of the human condition. Trust is often contagious and self-reinforcing. When someone shows me that they trust me and that they are willing to act on that trust, it feels like a powerful invitation, a duty even, to return the favor. And if I do trust them in return, our relationship is strengthened. At the same time, and as a result, when someone trusts me, that experience can change the relationship I have to myself and my self-image. So trust can be transformative at both the individual and the interpersonal levels, and frequently combines the two in virtuous spirals. The spiral can be fragile, however. If one of us turns out in the end to be less than trustworthy, trust can break down in an instant. Given the fundamental role that trust plays in human relationships, it's a bit of a surprise that the growing research literature on desistance, broadly defined as the process where repeat offenders stop offending and turn their attention to leading a law-abiding life, has not yet given much attention to the question of trust. Researchers have studied the role the criminal justice system and various prison and probation service professionals can play when it comes to facilitating and strengthening desistance processes, but they have not yet asked whether and how the phenomenon of trust may play a part. Now, it's true that several of the theoretical concepts frequently used in the desistance literature, such as recognition and tertiary desistance, may be said to have a close connection to the phenomenon of trust. And in that sense, the concept of trust can perhaps be seen as a kind of a theoretical absent presence in the literature. And before I move on, I should say that I do know of a small number of exceptions to this rule, which I will reference in the written paper, which this talk is based on. But if anybody out there feels overlooked in what I've just said, please do send me an email. Anyway, in my paper today, I want to put the concept of trust center stage and show how trust is potentially useful in an exploration of what Crew and Evans have called reinventive prisons and the role tertiary desistance may play in such institutions. My argument is based on an ongoing research project where I follow 14 repeat offenders from when they're in prison and start preparing for release, through the release process and back into society post-release. I interview them at various stages of the process, planning to do a final interview 10 years post-release. In addition, I also interview members of their personal networks, significant others, good friends, and so on, as well as representatives of the criminal justice system, mostly prison personal contact officers or probation service caseworkers, to get their insights into the complex release and reintegration process. The overall goal of the project is to identify and map the individual, interpersonal, and structural resources that are important when repeat offenders try to make significant changes happen in their lives. The project will also explore how relevant criminal justice and welfare state agents, such as prison and probation officers and social workers, may add to or limit these resources. Without going into too much depth, I would like to give a bit of theoretical background. Desistance is often described as a process with distinct stages. According to Farrell and Maruna, primary desistance refers to any crime-free gap in the course of a criminal career. Secondary desistance happens when the changes in behavior is accompanied by the adoption of a related non-offending identity. More recently, McNeil has added a third phase to the model. Tertiary desistance happens when the change process is recognized by other people. The desisting individual has changed not only in his or her own eyes, but according to other people as well. The transition from secondary to tertiary desistance hinges on the relationship between the I and the me, between self and other, between personal and social identity. When a desister can see themselves as a changed person also through the eyes of other people, tertiary desistance is a fact. And this is where I think trust can play a major part. Showing to someone that you trust them and that you're willing to act on that trust is probably one of the more common ways of actually demonstrating this kind of recognition in practice. Which brings me to the social context of the prison. I think it's fair to say that prisons are frequently characterized by a significant trust deficit. Of course, prisons are rarely totally devoid of trust. According to Liebling and Arnold, at least a minimum level of trust is essential to social cooperation, even in a prison. So trust does exist, but it's frequently fragile and unstable. This should come as no surprise, given that prisons, in a sense, are designed architecturally as well as systemically to lessen the importance of trust. Prison managers and prison staff are, as a rule, preoccupied with risks and with the everyday management and reduction of risks. Critical voices might even claim that prisons are frequently risk-obsessed. Prisoners often describe being subjected to close scrutiny by an institution which is more or less exclusively looking for faults and lacks and dangers, a kind of institutionalized distrusting gaze which McNeill has called the malopticon. This kind of highly risk-sensitive optic may have a number of negative consequences, including consequences at the level of individual prisoners, their behavior in prison, and their orientations towards the future. As Hawley puts it, people who are rarely trusted do not have the opportunity to develop that trustworthiness and cannot be expected to respond with alacrity when trust is offered to them. This is one of the damaging elements of suffering from long-term distrust. In such an environment, it makes little sense to develop traits of trustworthiness if these will go unrecognized. This in turn makes the habitually distrusted harder to trust, and the downward spiral continues. Now, Hawley is not talking specifically about prisons here, but it seems clear that many, if not most, prisons are not ideal arenas for developing trust and trustworthiness. In his influential theoretical treatment of the concept of trust, Hardin goes one step further and explicitly singles out the prison as an arena where trust only very rarely is allowed to successfully develop. He writes, the structure of prisons and the behavior of prison guards often provoke distrust between prisoners. Among the most obvious devices, setting up the cells so that any one prisoner cannot see any other, but every one of them can hear the noise of every other, creates tension and hostility between individual prisoners. They can become virtual enemies rather than allies who might pose a common front against the guards of the system. So if trust can create reciprocal trust, if trust in a sense is contagious, so is distrust, and prisons are normally institutions where distrust thrives. Officers frequently cultivate a working persona that demands of them that they generally distrust prisoners. This institutionalized professional distrust is built into the routines of the institution, and it is a vital part of the prison officer role. Prisoners, for their part, are often under strict obligation to not talk to officers. Prisoners who do may be accused of sharing privileged information with outsiders, a practice which is known among followers of the inmate code as grassing or snitching. It should come as no surprise then that the participants in my study describe the experience of being seen as untrustworthy as a pervasive part of the prison experience. One among many possible examples is this reaction one of them got when he told the middle manager at Ullesmo prison that he had decided to turn his life around and make some drastic changes. He told me, he said to me, that between 5 and 6 in the afternoon, when the prison is on lockdown, there's a line outside his door of people who want to tell him about how straight they've gone and that they now want to turn their lives around. So telling them that you've made some changes, they don't believe you at all. They know the likelihood of you returning to Ullesmo is like 80%. And if it isn't Ullesmo, it's another prison. So when you're on your 8th conviction, nobody listens to you, basically. You'll get no support. You have to take care of yourself. That's the road you have to travel by yourself. Prisoners often report feeling that they've done everything right, participated in all the programs, expressed their motivation, they've ticked all the boxes, and still the prison won't trust them. This lack of recognition can create frustration and a sense of disappointment when officers fail to validate their efforts. From this perspective, prisons do not, generally speaking, look like good places to cultivate trustworthiness and trusting relationships, But perhaps some prisons are better than others. My impression is that some prisons go further than others when it comes to acting on trust, and also when it comes to accepting the uncertainties involved, creating an environment where positive change is recognized and perhaps even encouraged. These institutions, in some cases at least, seem to approximate what Crew and Jevons have called reinventive prisons. According to one of the participants in my study, this is exactly what happened to him at Skien prison. I spent 5 years there, he told me, and they were amazing, the officers there. They supported you, they paid attention, they knew how to help you to move on. Sure, some of the officers you don't want to interact with, but the rest of them you could have long conversations with, and that meant that they were able to see, when you only have 6 guys in a unit, you're able to see who to support and who not to, you know? They were very good, really put a lot of effort into it. And there I got accompanied leave after just having served a year on a 13-year conviction to go see my kids down in Skien. We went to the swimming pool, things like that, so they trusted me fairly quickly. They could see that I wanted to make a change. Another participant told me about the transfer from high security to Kroksrud, a low security prison. I was lucky, he said. I got top grades on all the Christmas exams in school. And that was the first thing I did at Kroksrud. And when they saw the grades, their reaction was like, okay, nobody here gets grades like that. He said to me, the Norwegian language teacher, that he hadn't seen anybody as eager as me ever. It was like he could give me an assignment and I would ask for 2 more because I didn't want to get bored over the weekend. It was ridiculous. It really triggered him. And after the people at school talked with the officers, I got a lot of freedom. I got some negative reactions from other prisoners because I could talk with the teacher and say, I'm tired today, I didn't sleep so good, can I just go to my room and sleep for a few hours? And that would be okay, because they knew that I would get the work done. Later, they would check up on me like 10 in the evening and I would be doing my schoolwork. The 2 prisoners I've quoted so far talked about these experiences as significant exceptions to the general rule of distrust and suspicion. There is one prison, however, which has been highlighted by several of the participants in my study as a place where trust is more of a rule than an exception. I'm talking about Bastøy prison. Situated on a small island in the Oslo fjord, this low security prison holds 115 male prisoners. According to staff at Bastøy, they see trust there as a part of a coordinated effort to strengthen positive change. The personal contact officer of one of my participants wanted me to understand the reasoning behind this strategy. It's crazy, he told me. The first years, back when Bastøy opened back in '84, Bastøy bought a boat, a Draco speedboat. They even put correctional services on the side of it in big letters, and the officers went around the island in that boat every day. It was a cat and mouse game. I'm sure that if we wanted to follow that logic today, that pattern, life at Bastøy, would have been all about that game. We would have gotten a lot of positive drug tests, confirmation that the prisoners can't be trusted, that they are dangerous. Would it in some ways have been sort of an invitation to participate in the cat and mouse game, I ask? You get more trouble because the person would go looking for trouble all the time. Is that what you're saying? Yes, in a way, I think so, he responded. If we were to tighten our grip and take on a more suspicious attitude, we would inevitably move away from normal relationships, like we're having now, just talking, the 2 of us. Our lack of trust would give them a reason to trust us, to distrust us. Now, I should say, I'm perfectly aware that Bastøy is not perfect, and I don't have time to give a full or even balanced account of life at Bastøy today, but suffice to say that not all prisoners at Bastøy feel trusted all the time. But based on the data collected from my study, it seems clear that staff at Bastøy, at least in some cases, are able to create a sense of common trust in their relationships with prisoners. Another example, a senior member of the management team at Bastøy discussed the case of another participant in the study, who at the time was being shown an extraordinary level of trust with me. The prisoner in question was given leave to go to another Norwegian city by airplane to sit his university exam, staying in a hotel overnight by himself. He is pushing your limits a bit, I asked him. He is, but it's up to us. But I'm thinking that this is such a good thing for him. But another person would probably say no. At the same time, I'm thinking that yes, he gets to travel to another Norwegian city, has to pay everything out of his own pocket. He goes up there, finishes his exam, Yes, he has to spend a night in a hotel. In my mind, this is good for society. I could have argued against it, said, no, let's not take that risk, but why not? What's the argument against it? You show them a lot of trust, to use that term, I said. We do, but you know what? We've had no bad experiences. And I often ask prisoners about trust and why they don't do anything wrong when we trust them. We're thinking about the prison, they say. I'm thinking of you. You have approved my application and show me all this trust, and I don't want to disappoint you. I hear that a lot. Prisoners who want to make significant changes in their lives need opportunities to show to themselves and others that they really have changed. Many prisons do not allow prisoners such opportunities. It seems to me that some prisons, such as Bastøy prison, are better than others when it comes to being reinventive institutions in this sense. The problem, of course, is that one cannot see change, growth, motivation, or good intentions directly on someone's face. And we know that there is a tendency among prison officers and managers to err on the side of safety, and perhaps this is only natural. According to Bayer, trusting someone in general is always a risk. In cases where all risks have been removed, there is no trust, only certainty. So when prison staff trust prisoners, and when they choose to act on that trust, there is always the risk that things might backfire with newspaper headlines and ruined careers as potential results. The important question is whether the potential benefits outweigh the risks. The best we can hope for in any situation when we're deciding whether to act on trust is to try to take risks at the optimal level. What does optimal mean in the context of a prison? For a desistance-oriented, reinventive prison at least, optimal should mean as much growth, change, and support as possible, with as few damaging consequences as possible. As one participant put it, he was imprisoned at Bastøy at the time. You reap what you sow, right? He said. If you treat people well, they will behave well, like good people more or less. But if you crack down on them, tighten everything, and create a prison based on a logic of revenge, what happens is that if they ever get the chance, they do something even worse when they get than what they did before. If it's vengeance you want, then vengeance you'll get. The trust that they show me when I'm allowed to leave the island by myself, that means that I don't add to the hatred. I see hope. I see future, like everybody here. According to Hawley, it becomes difficult to trust ourselves if others do not trust us. And conversely, if others show me that they believe that I am trustworthy, it may help me believe that I'm worthy of that trust. In conclusion, since trust has to be placed without absolute guarantees, it's inevitably sometimes misplaced, and prisons should be wary of trusting too much. But they should be more afraid of trusting too little. According to Hardin, misplaced distrust, trusting too little, creates an aggregate of lost opportunities. Misplaced trust, trusting too much, on the other hand, leads to an aggregate of some real losses as well as some real gains. Overall, the gains from acting on trust may on the long run far outweigh the losses from doing so. Trusting a trustworthy prisoner may lead to proper life change and growth, and thus to major gains at the long run for not just the individual, but society as a whole. I understand, of course, that trust cannot be used as a general rule in all prisons at all times. In many cases, the risks are too big, the uncertainties too many, and the potential consequences too serious for proper trust to be possible, at least at the beginning of a prison term. But today, in many prisons, distrust is not the result of a sound and informed decision. It is the default position. For managers and staff who want to take the idea of a reinventive and desistance-oriented prison seriously, creating a situation where trust is possible and where staff are allowed to act on that trust should be a priority. Thank you.
Thank you. All of these talks so well interrelated, and that was a great talk about the transformative power of trust, but also its mutuality and the importance of its mutuality. We have many, many questions. We have a little less time than normal for Q&A, so I may have to be selective in which questions I choose. So thank you everyone for posing your questions. Let me start at the top. A question from Karan to Alison. As per your study, how far was the level of distrust related to the prejudices regarding the identity of the prisoners?
Thank you. Yes, good question. And I didn't go into detail on the distribution of trust and distrust, but it was really clear that it was based on prejudices about prisoners. I think that's part of the point that we want to make in this study, and that it varied by prison. So in general, being Muslim in a prison puts you in the highest risk category in a high security prison. Interestingly, being Black or mixed race varied by location in the country. So the prison in the middle of our two extreme prisons was a prison in the Midlands in Birmingham, which is quite a mixed, it's where I grew up. It's a mixed city with a very much more diverse staff group. And we could see from the results that being Black was not a kind of added risk factor in that prison, but it was very much so in the other two. So there'll be, when we write this up, we'll make that much clearer. So thank you very much for the question.
So very much context dependent. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
So I'm going to jump down a little bit in order to give a question to Yvonne. Thank you, Yvonne, this is from Georgie. For an enlightening talk. I noticed that with the Maggie's centers, there was a lot of yellow and green in the pictures. These are colors often associated with hope and positivity. I also noticed these colors in Limerick prison furnishings and in the inclusion of the gardens. Are there other symbols of hope in nature specifically, in addition to physical architecture, that you personally have found influential on feelings of hopefulness or that you found in your research?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, colour is a really personal thing, and I am writing about it in the book. It's quite interesting that grey is seen as a symbol of mental atrophy in prisons, and yet in home decor terms, in terms of interior design, my own house included, grey is very popular. But I think colours like yellow and green obviously are very predominant in nature. Blue, again, is a symbol of hope, I think, because it's found in nature. And I think in terms of actual things rather than just colours, blue space is very important. I've written a paper with Dominique Moran and Jennifer Turner on the importance of blue space in prisons, which is on the conference website. Other things, I mean, I just think prison designers, they do well to spend money on landscaping and get, you know, proper qualified landscape architects in. Though having said that, I mean, just wide open spaces go a long way to making prisons feel calm and.
We lost you here on the tail end. At least for me, it's quiet.
Oh.
So to maybe just the last, few words that you just shared.
Yeah, it says my internet connection is unstable. So I'll make this quick. Norgerhaven, a prison that I visited with Alison, had a wide open space in the middle of the accommodation called the Park, where prisoners could just hang out, chill, relax, chat to each other, smoke, and so on. And that helped with the feeling of calm and hopefulness there, I think. The other thing I'd just say is that landscape architects in prisons need to be bold. So the thing that I thought that Limerick prison would stand or fall on was the mature trees. And I really emphasised that they had to be mature trees, little saplings were not going to cut any ice, I didn't think. And, I always think bad nature is almost worse than no nature in prison. So when there are just kind of a few scraggy begonias or half-hearted shrubs or whatever, they seem to communicate to me hopelessness almost more than nothing at all. So I'll leave that there.
Thank you for that response. Okay, I'm going to head down to a question specifically to Thomas from Hubin. In the case of Baschoy, what or how much of this trust is related to training a sense of responsibility and in turn, responsibilization among prisoners?
So good question. I would say that is very much part of the point of the sort of the overall strategy. When you arrive at Baschoy by ferry, you're greeted by a sign that says that, loosely translated, this is an arena where you should develop responsibility, something like that. And that means that Baschoy obviously isn't for everybody, and many prisoners describe it as quite challenging to be there, because you're supposed to act according to these you're in a certain way, to sort of, you're getting all these opportunities, but you're also supposed to make the most of them, right? So some prisoners decide to, when they've tried it, decide to move back voluntarily to the high security estate, because they see it as much more easy, and decisions are made for you, and you don't have to obviously be this model prisoner who wants to change and who wants to take responsibility for everything all the time. And as always in all Norwegian open prisons, the closed prison estate is always there waiting for you if you don't behave according to the expectations of the institution.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Another question for Alison from Kaylee. Thank you. Is felt trust enough? What does actual legitimate trust look like?
I love this question, Kaylee, and I'm going to be thinking about it for a long time. I talked about felt distrust because it felt like that was it was something I felt and had moral kind of qualms about. And so in my reading, it's really clear to me that both trust and distrust are action oriented, that they inevitably result in action. So when I think about felt trust or actual trust, it was clear to us that when prisoners were trusted, they were allowed to do things. They were allowed to turn up for education classes, be interviewed by us, do work. Eventually, it would help them to be downgraded, to get off category A, to move forwards in the system. So there's a very strong relationship between the feeling of being trusted and the actuality and the practical implications. And I think, a bit like Thomas has suggested, you could see that one step would lead to another step, and that you would start to get onto a kind of trust building, trust placing cycle, which could often be transformative in terms of the practicalities of serving a long sentence. So I think there's a lot to say in this area, and I love the question, the way you've put it, and the concept of actual and legitimate trust. So I should be thinking about those things with the data a lot more. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Kaylee, for your question. Okay, another for Yvonne from Sandra. Yvonne, thanks so much. With places like Maggie Center or Limerick, which certainly looks great by prison standards, how have prison authorities or politicians navigated the lesser eligibility issue? Is this a constant issue you encounter in your work?
Yeah, great question. It is a constant issue. I mean, I'm not going to trash talk Limerick before it even opens by predicting bad things for it. But I mean, the problem with the Doka Centre is one of overcrowding, and inspectors' reports have criticised the courts basically for sending too many women to prison, and that's a question for my colleagues who work in processes of criminalisation and sentencing. In terms of the prison itself, less eligibility is always an issue, but it tends to be less of a public issue with women than men. And one of the things that I always say is that there's no reason why women should be treated specially or differently to men when it comes to prison design. But there's no doubt that for women, it's an easier sell to the public to design progressive, creative, imaginative, humane prison environments. And that's something that I'm going to be continuing to work on as my career goes forward, in trying to convince public and politicians and key stakeholders that actually men and women should be treated the same, and it's good for all of us if we provide less brutal environments for prisons. But yeah, it's a constant issue that comes up. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so this next question is to both Alison and Thomas. So maybe Thomas, you want to speak to it first. It's from Luca. Thank you so much for your talks. Do you think there is value in thinking about trust in prison that operates, on the one hand, at an interpersonal, interactional level, but also the dynamics of trust, or the collapse, decline of trust, in abstract systems, such as the criminal justice system a la Giddens?
Yeah, thank you. That was quite a difficult question, I think. I'm not, I should say, I'm not familiar with the text that he's referring to. I don't think I've read it, but like I said, prisons in general are systems where trust, in a sense, has already collapsed. I mean, they're a very sort of, most prisons are very sort of low trust environments, right? They're built to make trust obsolete, in a sense. Some prisons more than others, but even most open prisons, even in countries like Norway, will have a significant level of distrust. So, and that is definitely systemic, right? And that systemic distrust certainly shapes every relationship, every interaction in the prison. You can't really sort of bracket that. You can, obviously, you will have relationships between prisoners and officers. In high security prisons, they may have known each other for years. They may have, if you have a prisoner with a long sentence, the officer may know that prisoner better than members of his or her own family, in a sense, right? But the systemic distrust will always be there, right? So even when that officer opens the cell door of that prisoner, that officer is supposed to take precautions, because even though I've known this individual for all these years, I'm supposed to act as if that person can assault me at any time, right? So that is part of the system, and it's very rarely, it's more or less always there. I don't know if that was an answer to the question, but I tried anyway.
Yes, and thank you, Yvonne, or Alison. Sorry, did you want to add to that?
Yes, just because I noticed in passing, I made one throwaway remark about the conditions of late modernity. And so that was my Giddens bit, that I didn't obviously have time to say anything about that, but Luca, you're spot on. And that it's significant that our very low trust prison was a very new penological and bureaucratic prison, whereas the slightly higher trust prison was very much old penology. It was kind of less impacted by the new penological, the abstract construction of risk. So I think there's a lot to say about what the impact on day-to-day prison life has been of these abstract systems of distrust. So as well as being a prison, it's a prison that's orchestrated. I'd like to use the word as sort of architecture of distrust, but by architecture here, I mean not Yvonne's architecture, but the bureaucratic infrastructure, which is all about risk and not at all about trust. So it's very related to what's going on in the world around us.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And perhaps we have time for one last question. And it's to Yvonne. This is from one of my undergrads, so I'm playing my chair role here and prioritizing a question. I often suppose that prisons were intentionally designed the way they are as a way to add to the punishment of incarceration. Do you think this idea of removing part of the punishment by having more hopeful architecture may be a concern for some in the general public?
It may be a concern for some in the general public, but we have to educate the general public. I mean, my answer to this is very simple. People go to prison as punishment, not for punishment. And the guys that we interviewed at Halden Prison, for example, which is held up around the world as the model prison architecturally, reported as painful an experience in that high security prison as you find in studies by Ben Crew and Alison and others. And I've got a chapter coming out about that in a book co-edited by Ben shortly about the pains of Halden Prison. So, you know, it's not the case that hopeful, imaginatively designed prisons are holiday camps by any stretch of the imagination. You know, the loss of liberty is everything.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our presenters, and thank you to the audience. We're going to end things there, and please join us at 11 o'clock for a panel titled